lift up these things that weigh heavy on our hearts. We thank you that you are a God who hears and a God who heals. We pray as we walk through the text this week, we may be a people of more compassion to those who are our neighbors and even those who are our enemies and pursue justice around us. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, welcome back to Journey Through the Bible. So we are here in the book of Deuteronomy, which we will only be in for a few more weeks. And today is like the top of the hill of the mountain. That is the hard part. We will hit a peak at the end of our class. It's the second to the last chapter. That is, again, one of my favorite kind of sections. And next week is my favorite part of Deuteronomy. It's the blessings and the curses. And so if I forget to say it at the end, although I made a whole slide so I wouldn't forget it, we'll have our field trip next week. And so we'll have our little activity of either walking across the room or maybe even the labyrinth, but I think I'll be outvoted of going outside, so we'll see. Also, as a reminder, we do have books in the library, and they are there, and our library ladies, as Bo said when y'all showed up yesterday, have spent a lot of time looking for different books. And just for our schedule coming up, so we are in chapters 19 through 26. Next week, we will slow down from kind of speeding through all of these laws. We will do chapters 27 through 30. That is the blessings and the curses. It's going over the covenant. And then after that, we will do the conclusion to Deuteronomy. On September 5th, we'll do a Deuteronomy wrap-up. So we'll kind of go back through some of the material as a review. And the videos that I kept running out of time to play, we will play some of those on that day, which I am looking forward to that. And then we'll start John, which I am very much looking forward to. Just as a reminder about the book of Deuteronomy, again, this is the second law. It's a retelling of the law. I say that again because especially last week and this week's material is very, very, very repetitive. And it is even annoying when you read it because it is so repetitive, which is part of why we're moving through this part so quick. But it is arranged somewhat in a different way and said in a different way because it's those new words for a new generation. We are right here in this middle speech from Moses that's all about the laws. Looking at that just in a little more detail. So last week we covered these two parts. It was all about Israel's worship. And if you remember, like we said, the way that you worship God influences how you treat other people. In fact, some of the acts of worship are actually helping other people. And then we ended last week by talking a lot about Israel's leaders. And if you're wondering, why do we care so much about the leaders? There's two answers. One of them is we are now about to move into the promised land. So these are the last speeches before they go into the land. And also this is written when Israel is coming out of exile from Babylon and they're about to rebuild a temple. And so they're resetting up how to have priests and prophets and all of that. Today is going to tackle a lot of different civil laws, and it's going to deal with different avenues of justice, which we call social justice, which is kind of what do you do with the poor, the widow, those kind of disenfranchised by society. And then next week we'll move into that last speech. This is again where we were last week. We talked about Israel's worship. Again, it's connected to how you treat other people. We talked about the different leaders. You have priests, you have kings, you have prophets, all of those, and judges. And this is where we are today. So we're going to be talking about different civil laws, different social justice. And I grabbed this from the Bible Project chart to throw up here because I want to just go over back of these tips for reading it. So one of them is these are part of a covenant. We talked about that last week, about the Caesarean treaty that you would have where there was a vassal that would serve a big emperor, and it's setting the terms. And it's, if you serve me, I will give you protections, but there are stipulations of what you have to do. And so a lot of these laws are these stipulations. And they're not all bad stipulations. Some of them are kind of difficult about military service or paying taxes, but others are just how you treat each other. It's just the law of the land sort of thing, and it comes with all these benefits. The other thing to know, and again, we talked about this last week, don't compare them with today's laws. That's not really fair for Deuteronomy. It's a really old book. it wasn't written for us. And so we have to kind of go back into that old mindset. And so compare them to these ancient laws. I talked about the law code of Hammurabi last week. We talked about some of the Hittite laws. I'm going to make a few other references to those and see kind of how some of these laws are different to them. And then also, as we talked about, look for the underlying principle. We will do that at the end in chapter 25. We're only going to do it once, just one little exercise of that. Some of the parts I just want to remind us from last week, we talked about how the worship was centralized. And so instead of having all these altars throughout the land, and you could do all these things throughout the land, now it's all about this place that the Lord has chosen, and we're calling it, it's the temple. It's essentially the temple. There's also the part about dietary laws and tithing, and I just find that fascinating, but it's going to kind of come back up today, not talking about what you eat, but in what you wear or other things. And if you'll remember, we said anything that was unclean blurred the categories. And so you had land, sea, and air, and anything that mixed those categories essentially would be what is unclean. And so we have these very distinct categories. We'll see that again today, like you don't mix the fabrics in your clothes. You don't mix the seed that you sow in a field. Some of those are not practical. They actually go against what would be a better practice, but it's about distinctions. Everything has a category. The world is ordered. God made an ordered world, and so we want to keep it ordered. We also talked about the sabbatical year or that Jubilee year last year. That's one idea that's very beautiful. Every 7th year, everything would be reset. Everything was equalized. And we talked about some annual festivals. Those 3 big pilgrimage feast of Israel was a part of their worship, and included in a lot of that would be sharing food with other people. Before we move into today's text, does anyone quickly have questions about, okay, John?
One thing that struck me, throughout here, they separate cities for people who did bad stuff.
Yes.
And to me, I call them like prison cities. That's what they seem like. It's just they don't have the walls and the bars.
Yes, that's interesting. So we talked about this back in Deuteronomy in reference, that's chapter 19, right? Yeah, 19, the cities of refugee. And so you can kind of imagine this. If you're a nation without a large police force, you take justice into your own hands. And so we had talked about that way back in Deuteronomy, but the cities of refuge were a way of limiting retribution in escalation. And so like if people have different family feuds. And so typically the way it would work is if someone, if you killed Poppy or something, I don't like that example, that makes me sad. So if Mysterious Bob and his wife died, was killed by someone, and Bob is angry, so there would be a designated family redeemer, say it's his uncle. And that uncle would go after whoever had killed that person. And so say like he was in a wagon and the wheel fell off and it crushed Bob's wife. Well, that wasn't actually his fault. And so, but the redeemer of the family, typically in other societies, they would just go and still kill that guy. And that could start a family feud. Think Romeo and Juliet, these family feuds that go on for generations. And so the cities of refuge would say that guy that kills Bob's wife could flee there, and there he could await trial. And so it was this limiting factor. It stopped family feuds, it stopped blood vengeance, and it also contributed to a court system. And they weren't stuck there forever. It doesn't mention it in Deuteronomy, but it does back in Numbers. Anytime there was a new high priest, everyone was set free. And you could go and live out your days. So that's not in Deuteronomy, but it is in Numbers.
Does the 7-year reset?
Not for cities of refuge, I don't think. At least not so far where we've read in the Bible. That might happen later, but I'm not thinking of that right now. Any other questions? I knew you would raise your hand.
Well, when you use the word law, there's implicit enforcement. Mm-hmm. If you violate the law, who was designated within the Israeli community for enforcing the law? And what was the punishment?
Yeah, well, it depends. It depends on what it is. Sometimes it would be up to the family to deal with certain matters.
Family?
Typically, and we saw this system set up last week, they would have judges in every city. So for most issues, you would go to the judge in your city. Other times, though, it might be a problem that's a little bit too big for them to deal with. In that case, they would go to like the Supreme Court. They would go to Jerusalem, and the priest and the high judge there would just figure out the dispute. And the one that would issue the punishment, again, it depends. Sometimes that would be someone designated. Oftentimes, the accuser, if it was stoning, would have to throw the first stone, which kind of puts the weight in your court, and then the whole community would join in that punishment. And that was a way of saying, if you accuse someone, it's weighty. I mean, taking any life is always a big deal, but it also distributes the punishment. Like, you don't know who threw the last stone. And so, but it depends. We'll see some of those in today's text. Different things have different punishments. Like, we're going to learn about lashing today. And we talked about stoning last week. We're going to talk about hanging and other things. So it depends.
Cutting off hands.
Cutting off hands. Oh, yeah, that was fun. I listened to a very cool podcast about that on Monday morning, I think. That, yeah, it was interesting if you want to know more about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into some of our chapters. We're going to cover a lot of things. I'm just going to mention the first chapter. So we're going to look at the cities of refugees and some different legal principles. Here's a map of some of those different cities of refuge. My slides are having issues. This is not showing everything that it tells me is up there. Okay. And now it's not changing at all. Here. If there's nothing on the screen, just wave at me, and I will try and fix it. So the first thing this chapter is going to deal with is different cities of refugees, and it's also going to talk about different boundaries and then how you fulfill the law with integrity, especially with its enforcement. The first thing is there are 6 different cities of refuge. Just as a note, so there's 3 across the land, and so these are the Transjordan cities over here, and there's also 3 more over here. There are stipulations kind of in this section about like if you expand, how to add more cities, so everyone is within 1 day's walking distance. You can get there pretty quickly. And just as a note, this area we would say is kind of less, it's less, not regulated, but over here there's more hills, it's farther, like this is less centralized over here. It's kind of more like a free man's land on that side, on the Transjordan colonies. It's more rural, if you will, over there. And so, like we kind of mentioned before, this is weird. I don't know why this is not. I'm going to disconnect this and try and reconnect this real quick. We'll see what it turns into. Okay. Part of what this is going to cover with the cities of refuge is intentional killing versus unintentional killing. And so again, like we just talked about before, if you had unintentionally killed someone, to stop the family designated blood avenger, you could flee to that city. There you would await trial. It is special when you would be awaiting trial because you would have to have witnesses. This is really throwing my brain off because it's not loading this stuff on here.
So you're saying when Alexander, when you were waiting in the cities for trial, is that right?
Yeah. Hold on just a second. We're gonna just move to one screen and just plug it in right here. Give me just a second because it's not throwing my slides up, and that is gonna throw me off.
Which one are you keeping?
I don't know. I'm confused.
I don't think it knows.
I don't know what's happening with this. I'm trying to use this one.
Put it on PC. PC's the bottom one.
Yeah, I have it in the HTML 1. Ah, here we go. I'm sorry. Thank you for being patient with me. I don't know why this is being...
It happens to the best of us.
Technology.
It's those gremlins again.
Go back to Earth.
I've had it happen to me. Teacher. Sometimes you just have to throw it out.
And I knew nothing about it, so I
That's
can't
good.
say a
And
thing.
it makes things simpler and nicer when it works.
I just can't figure out where my
How many times I've called up something, well, computers are down. I can't help you. What happened to go into a file?
There we go.
Oh, I
We came back.
grew up.
Yes. Gotta have it.
It's just like we don't even have film strips back in the day. Back in the day, it was like, well, it doesn't matter.
Okay, can everyone see this screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
Is it enough that you can look at it?
We're
Okay.
fine.
Ah, okay. Thank you. Sorry, that was really confusing me. And I have our slides laid out really intentionally. Oh, it's still not doing it. What is going on with this? This is weird. There we go. All right, we might just keep stuff in chunks. And so, okay, the cities of refuge, they would stop blood vengeance. You would go through a trial. There had to be witnesses. It was a whole court system, which is cool. Again, this is an elevation of kind of a justice system, which is really unique to see. In the ancient world, things are not as regulated as they are, like when we live here in 21st century America. And so this is stopping that escalation from taking place. This is also going to talk about different boundary and legal integrity, but I wanted to mention that if you're interested in learning more about the cities of refuge, this is the video we played back when we watched Numbers. I don't want to play it again because we already played it in here, but I included the link to it. It's here, and I will send it out with the show notes. And that is going to cover some of the other way that ancient societies would organize their justice and talk about these different cities of refuge. The other part that this chapter is going to deal with is these boundary limits and having different legal integrity. I put a picture of these two rocks here. So these are in the outskirts of Israel. And here is an example of some of these boundary limits. They would put up these big stones. That makes sense. They don't have fences. And sometimes they would even mark it. This one's really cool. We found this this century, but it has Greek and Aramaic or Hebrew on it, which is kind of cool. And it has a family name. And so here's an example of when it's talking about these different boundary stones, a picture of what that might be like. And it might not surprise you to know that sometimes, when you're out in this field and it's marking the different clan lines, they would go and get a couple of guys to scoot the stone over every couple of months, and they would slowly take more land. That happens today still. And so there are laws dealing with doing that, which is to say, don't do that. And so, there's also going to be different principles about how you have to have witnesses. If you're going to be accusing someone, then you're going to have witnesses when you do so. This is also going to cover something that we call the law of retaliation. And you may have heard this phrase, the lex talionis. And so this is the phrase, a life for a life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Funny note, at some point I was trying to find a picture of this, and I kept typing ear for an ear. And I was like, why is this not popping up? And I was like, ear for an ear Bible verse. And it was just showing me like ear diagrams. And I was like, ear for an ear, tooth for a tooth. And then it was like a sinus diagram of the face. And so I will never unhear ear for an ear. But it's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And I think this is a fun topic to just talk about. And one of the lines that I'll say a lot when we read the Bible is the story isn't over yet. And so when we're starting way back here, we're getting this glimpse of God kind of reaching out to us. So here, we are people and we tend to mess things up. We tend to be mean to each other. Sometimes we have good intentions, but we like to get back with people. And this limits that kind of what we call vengeance, but really it's just our unbridled wrath at people. And so this is a limiting factor. If someone took a life, you only take their life back. If someone plucks out someone's eye, you only take that eye. So you don't kill someone because they stepped on your foot. You don't burn their house down because they stole your horse or something like that. This sounds harsh to us, but in the ancient world, this is very limiting. In comparison to other law codes in the ancient Near East or Babylonian law codes, this type of line is a little bit different because the ancient world, the other law codes, everything had a financial value, which I'm really glad Deuteronomy doesn't go and just give dollar values to everything. But if you had plucked out someone's eye, there was a dollar value that you would pay back. If you stole someone's ox, there was a dollar value for what you would pay back. What's different about the biblical text is it makes things a bit more personal in that sense. And the other thing just about this, in the very long podcast that I've listened to, I will summarize it to say we never have any evidence of this type of retaliation actually happening. And so, like, there was not a lot of one-eyed people going around. There was not a lot of one-handed people going around. It was a way of just saying, let the punishment be equal to what they did. So, yeah. Does that make sense there? Okay. Jesus, though, remember the story's not over yet. Jesus goes a step farther. And so, we're going to read this verse in Matthew 5. It's from the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand them over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Jesus says go a step farther. And this is, like, when you know some of the background of this, the stipulations that he's mentioning here were the Roman laws that Jews had to follow. And so a Roman soldier, has all of their heavy gear and everything. They could grab any citizen and say, you have to march this 1 mile. And they would go 1 mile. And then they could give it to another citizen and say, you march this 1 mile. And Jesus says, hey, if a Roman soldier says, march my backpack, march 2 miles. Go farther. If someone was poor and is needy, you would have to give them over your shirt, but you would keep your cloak, which is like a blanket. It was important to have. Jesus says, give them your cloak too. And so everything in here is go farther, go above and beyond. Love your enemies even more. It's hard to do.
Why?
Why? Because we are to be a people of such generosity that it makes people curious and ask why. And so, yeah.
Just take advantage of you more.
Do what?
I said they tend to take advantage of you more.
Yeah, and I mean here Jesus says, let them. Because it's not mine to begin with, it's all God's. And so be a people of generosity. That's our lesson from 19. Okay, chapter 20, it's not really as fun, it's the laws of warfare. And so just another note, a lot of these old ancient law codes have lots of regulation for war. One thing that is particular to Canaanite law codes, wars are holy wars. And so you don't just battle because you're battling. They're very connected to God and the identity of that God and that people. With that said, the laws for Israel go a little bit beyond that. And so some of these regulations that we're going to see in warfare, they are rare that we're going to see in this chapter. There starts off with just this encouragement to the different soldiers. Trust God. And so here I got like a little baby with God holding their hands. And so there's this idea of just trust God. This war that they're fighting, it's not just a battle. It's this battle for the true God sort of thing. And so God says, I'll take care of you because I'm fighting with you. And so, you, my people, will be saved. Don't look at that slide yet. So I don't have an end devotion lesson for this chapter because I wanted to move through it quicker. But if you ever have big battles coming up, remember God's got your back. That's my way of trying to make this a little nicer. The other thing is that there is different exemptions from military service. So if someone was newlywed, if they were recently engaged, if they were nervous, I mean, I would feel like most people would be nervous.
I get the picture that they're saying if any of this, and then the whole truth, everybody goes, oh.
Yeah, no, that's what it's like. Yes, yeah.
And so if you haven't drank the wine out of your vineyard, I got to go home.
Again, connecting. This is really rare. Like this type of thing, like even if you're nervous, don't go fight. Like that's just very weird. There's stipulations if you have a new home, if you have a new vineyard. And I put a note to myself because I kept forgetting this. The laws in here, a new vineyard, it says if you haven't gone and eaten the fruits of your vineyard, you have to wait 5 years from planting a vineyard to actually harvest its fruit. And so this regulation for warfare is incredibly relaxed. We could just say that. It's like, oh, you just got married, so like you want to set up your house. Wait, even if you're just still engaged, okay, don't go. Oh, you might be nervous. Oh, you just planted a grapevine? Yeah, 5 more years. And so I just want to say, like this type of thing, it's rare, it's very relaxed. And so, yeah, it's going to stop them from kind of engaging in some of the other forced practices like the nations around them are in. There's also some stipulations for their conduct in battle. The first part deals with non-Canaanites. And so there is a few things that they are to do. The first thing is they offer peace and enslavement. And so they would go to a city, hey, we're about to take this city, but we can be friends. You just have to work for us. If the city said no, then they were to besiege the city. They were to kill all of the males and take everything else as spoils. And so, yes, that would include women and children. It would include all of their animals, their livestock, their money, their houses, all of those things. It would become the possession of Israel. Usually the people would end up in forced labor. We'll reference back to last week. There was regulations on how you treat prisoners of war, and there was more dignity given to them than is comparable to other law codes. If they're not Canaanite, if they are Canaanites, they get no offer of peace. They are to be destroyed, so they would kill the people, and the whole town would be annihilated. They would destroy the town, all the livestock. They would take no spoils or anything like that. Which, again, that type of thing is rare because most often people would go to war because they want what that city has. And so this is stopping you from kind of going to war to gain something. They would go to war, they would die, and have no gain from it. And so again, like that type of thing is rare. At the end of this chapter, there's the save the trees part. And so if you ever watch war movies, you know, like the scorched earth policy. So they would destroy landscapes. If you think back to like when Napoleon invaded Russia, and Russia was like, fine, we'll just make the land uninhabitable and destroy all the fields, cut down all the trees, and you can't live here. This stops that policy. There is no scorched earth policy. You can't destroy the land when you would go and fight. And so that's what that's about. I like that part. That's my favorite part of the chapter. Save the trees. Does anyone have a question on this?
Wasn't it just trees that had fruit that had to be
Yeah. So it's like for produce or fields, but it's all like you wouldn't cut down a whole forest so people couldn't hide in there. Like it's a way of saying don't let your war be your main fight. Leave the land to be habitable and good.
They killed a lot of people. A lot of killing.
There is a lot of killing.
Oof.
But remember, let's not read this with going back. Going back, this takes steps of human dignity that weren't there, and even environmental protection, again, that weren't there. We will continue with a theme of dignity, even if that chapter doesn't feel like it. Moving to chapter 21, we're going to do some various social and family laws. And so the first part that this has to deal with is, what do you do when there's an unsolved murder? And so typically, if someone was murdered and you didn't know who it was, the city would owe the family what was paid. This is going to cover for, like, you're out in the middle of nowhere, there's 3 cities of equal distance all around you, and you find a dead body. What do you do? Again, this was actually something other law codes dealt with, because that was a good question to ask. How does the family get paid? They don't have life insurance policies, so if the breadwinner, the husband, dies, that family would become destitute. So all ancient Near Eastern laws, they would have regulations to pay that family back. What do you do when you don't know with it? This goes through this different practice that they would use to atone the one who had died. So the way that they would go through it, they would go to the nearest town. So they would measure it out, I guess, by footsteps. They would find there a heifer that had not been worked, so like a young calf. They would break its neck, And if you remember what we talked about last week about the meat revolution, about sacrifices, sacrifices happen from slitting the neck because the blood is spilled. There's no blood spilled here, so they break the neck. That's why that detail is there. They would then have the town elders wash their hands over the heifer. So here you can see it, which is declaring their innocence. And then they would have the priest come out and they would pray for atonement to remove the community's blood guilt. This is a way of giving dignity back to the family. And it was a way of removing that guilt from the city. Again, going back to blood vengeance, if my family died near your town, then I might, get a band of raiders to go attack your town, and this stops that. Again, some of the different Hittite laws in the law code of Hammurabi, they would deal with different financial stipulations. So this is how much that town should pay. It's more personable, if you will. This is also going to deal with some different family and inheritance laws. I have no idea what this TV show is. I looked at Happy Family. I guess you can watch the show if you want. But this is going to start off by talking about the different... I guess I got my pictures a little bit confused here. So it's going to talk about some different rights of women that are taken captive. I have my notes on the wrong slide, so I'm going to go back to this slide, but it's supposed to be this picture. If there was a woman taken captive that was going to be as a wife, and I will say this is very revolutionary for the time. There was a series of things they had to go through. First, they would allow a time of mourning for the woman. And so that soldier, he could claim someone if he had found her, but they had to wait at least 1 month to have a time of mourning. After that, he had to be engaged to her, and then he could marry her. And so, which is a way of saying that she could not be raped, was not allowed in these rules. And so he had to marry her, but then if he did not like her, he had to actually dismiss her and let her go free. She was not a slave. She had the same kind of equal rights, and she could go free. This would prohibit them from again selling them as slaves, and it gives these prisoners of war dignity. They have citizenship status, sort of, if you will. And so, might sound uncomfortable to us, but for the time, this is a very revolutionary step. And there are similar other laws like this, but this one is much more generous, if you will. The other question is, what do you do with the rights of a firstborn son? And so, in particular, this is, what if one guy is married to multiple women, and maybe this wife is his favorite wife? Think Jacob, who had to marry Leah and didn't like her, and then later gets Rachel, who was his favorite wife. Or he has one son from one wife, and he just hates that son. Or something like that. This deals with the rights of the firstborn son, which is to say that whoever was the firstborn son, that son, no matter what, they were the one that would get the double portion of the inheritance. They were the one that the family lineage would continue through. This would stop you from picking favorites, either of wives or of children. Now, the question comes up is, what if you didn't like that son? Or sorry, not what if you didn't like that son. What if that son was bad? And that's the next part. There's laws concerning a rebellious son. For fun, here's Poppy this week having her temper tantrum. She army crawled like this from the car, through the yard, up the house, and up the stairs to her bed after her first day of preschool.
No guilt.
I thought it was a funny picture, and I didn't tell Rachel I put it in here. So this is not like if someone's having a temper tantrum sort of
Did she
thing.
not want to go to the daycare?
Oh, no, she was just tired after.
Okay.
Yeah, she was just worn out from the day. But this law here, it's not talking about like a temper tantrum with a toddler. This is like you have a son that's like going around and, killing people's cows and stealing their produce, and is like, one thing that would happen a lot in the ancient world is all of the young unmarried men would just form these gangs and wreak havoc all around and stuff. Just talking about that sort of thing. And if that's the case, they would go to the priest and say, my son's bad, and they would go out and stone them all together. And so this was a threat to me one time when I was growing up. And I was like, what in the world? And so it was a way of keeping your children in line. And
What
so,
was the threat? They go to stone you?
No, just a reference to this verse because I was being out of line or something. But this is not for like temper tantrum or like you stole someone's homework. This is like very, very big and bad, and it's a way of keeping the justice system in the family, and it's also about protecting the dignity of the family. There's a weird part at the end of this chapter that has to deal with hanging, and so it's what would you do if someone was hung because of their punishment. So they're not stoned, they're not crucified, like they've been hung. And they would have to be buried the same day. A lot of the commentaries that I read on this, again, this is a lot dealing with dignity. It's about giving dignity to that person that had been executed. My curious suspicion is that this maybe has something to do with the Zoroastrian practice, which was in Persia, where they would put dead bodies up on these big pillars, and the vultures would come and pick them clean. And so they would leave the bodies up there. So that was a respectful death for Zoroastrian death. And so it's actually a funny practice. Some American cities are like, how do we deal with that? That's their religious practice of burial, is to put them up in the sky and to be eaten. And so my curious suspicion is this is a way of saying don't be involved with that religion over there, because that's how that religion buries their people. Don't even let it look like it. Don't leave a body to be eaten by the vultures, because it's like that Zoroastrian thing. No commentary says that. That is just Alexander, but I feel really strongly about that, particularly with how this book is like, be very careful to not look like these other religions and their practices.
I went to some monasteries in Greece, and that's way back when. That's what they did with the monks when they died. They put them in the trees, and then you go down in the catacombs. You see all these shelves of skulls and bones and all that.
Yeah.
But that was very reverent. That was a way of disposing the body. And since they are on top of these buttes, they couldn't bury it.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because even like Jesus, when it talks about they had a family tomb, it wasn't like there was this one large room that was like all of these bodies were in there. They would put them in there to decompose. And after 1 year, they would take the bones out. Those bones would go to bone box. Sometimes the bone box would be buried. The normal way of burying in the ancient world was to let the flesh go away somehow. Rather, that's in the family tomb for 1 year, which was the period of mourning, or letting the vultures pick them clean, which is quicker. It's more efficient that way.
Is that like the air burial smell?
What is an air burial?
Without
You have to tell me about it. I'll look that up after. I don't know. So our lesson for 21, and I am very purposely, I keep saying the word dignity. This is about protecting the dignity of others. So these laws are all about dignity, even for our enemies. And so, if you're looking for one way to kind of live out these practices, is how do I uphold or upload the dignity of others? It's all about dignity. Moving on to chapter 22, we're going to talk about laws concerning morality and social responsibility. These chapters get a little bit more fun than some of the other ones. So there's rules. It's going to talk about how you deal with your neighbor's property or your neighbor's animals. There's going to be some laws on clothing and modesty, and then there's going to be some laws on sexual purity. The first thing is, what if your neighbor's oxen gets away and you see it walking down the road? So it was your job, if you saw it, you were supposed to go and get it and bring it back. And so, the summation of these verses is just help others, help your neighbor. And so don't just be all about yourself. The communities are supposed to watch out for each other. Oh, if we lived in a world like that, that would be nice. There's also some laws on clothing and modesty. And so there's some prohibitions against cross-dressing. I went through way too many pictures of cross-dressing, so I just picked a guy in a what is that? A kilt. Yeah. So, and again, this may not be something you care about today, but in the ancient world, particularly for Israel, keep things in their categories. It's about the world being well-ordered because God made a well-ordered world. Don't blur the categories. There's also going to just be some practical laws, like have a parapet or a fence around your ceiling. And so this is going to stop people from, you didn't have like a yard per se. You would kind of go up on your roof to do a lot of things. It was like a yard, stop people from falling off when they had a party and they had too much wine, so put a fence up. And so there's other sort of laws like that. There's laws about mixing species and materials. And so again, the fabrics of the clothing, and even in the fields. So like we know 3 sisters, like if you plant squash and corn and beans together, they produce more and make better food. Well, you couldn't do that in Israel. Again, the categories have to be kept clear. There's also some laws on sexual purity. So we're just going to categorize a lot of it. It's what the ancient world would call sexual immorality, and it deals with all of that. You're welcome to read it if you want. We're not going to go through it here. And there is this other section that is protection for women's rights in marriage. And so this is going to protect, which the context of that, the man is the one that could divorce. So the woman couldn't divorce, the man could divorce a wife. This is going to stop him from slandering her. So he couldn't go around like, oh, her cooking was bad, and that's why I did that. Or she was just an awful woman. It's protecting her dignity. It's going to have some stipulations about cheating and what you do. There's some stipulations about rape. These ones are kind of weird. So if a unbetrothed woman was raped, then the rapist could buy her and marry her, which to us sounds awful. In the context of this, she could reject it. So it was not like something that was forced. But then she could also say yes. And that was a way of, is like she's not broken goods sort of thing. And so again, this is the intention in all of these laws is about dignity. And so it was a way of saying like if you have committed to the act, then you have to protect her for the rest of your life. And so it was follow through for the man, not about taking the choice away from the woman. Does that make sense there?
Was this kind of revolutionary for the time? I mean, this seems
not this part. There's other similar laws in this section. So, yeah, I mean, some of it might be a step forward, but like this part about the rape part too is a common ancient Near Eastern law. So it wasn't always enforced, but like we're glad this is a good law in for the time. Moving on from there, chapter 23. Oh wait, I forgot to ask. Does anybody have any questions about that? Thank God. Okay, chapter 23. We're going to talk about exclusion and inclusion in the assembly. Again, we're kind of talking about the temple, the synagogue at this point. And so, yet again, rules. That's very common for this. So the first part is about eunuchs. Do you get the joke with the scissors? Okay, all right, cool.
The guys do.
So for the curious, there's 3 types of eunuchs. There are eunuchs from birth. That would be like maybe someone who is infertile or intersex. There's eunuchs that are forced, and so oftentimes prisoners of wars would be eunuchs, and that was not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of the court system, like around the emperor or the king, would love to be surrounded by eunuchs because you knew they wouldn't, cheat on you, and they have no family to uphold, and so it was nice to have eunuchs working for you. And there's also people that were eunuchs by birth, whether that meant they self-castrated or they just had a life of chastity or something like that. With that said, eunuchs are not allowed to go into the assembly. If you remember back when we talked about sacrifices, they had to be perfect and without blemish. It's related to that. You only bring what is the best, what is perfect, into the place where God is. There's also this weird line about illegitimate children. Just so you know, this may have had to do with cheating or like bastards, but more likely it's having to do with incest. And so there's the incest king. And so again, I went through way too many pictures for this chapter of trying to pick what was best. So we got scissors and him. And so the part about illegitimate children or incest goes to the 10th generation, which is very strict. So yeah. There's also some lines about the Ammonites and the Moabites, or the Edomites and the Egyptians. This is all foreigners. And so for the Ammonites and the Moabites, they were not allowed to enter the 10th generation, enter the assembly until the 10th generation. But the Edomites and the Egyptians only had to wait to the 3rd. And it's this kind of line about how the Edomites helped Israel, and they just kind of forget about the Egyptian slavery, but it's about how the Egyptians protected Israel for all of that time. And so that is who is excluded from the assembly. And so they're going to move into some different sanitary laws and different purities for war. And so you have a lot of young men and soldiers in battle camps. For those that had nocturnal missions, there was a ritual that they would go through to be cleansed before they could come back into the camp. Again, that was just perceived as being unhygienic or maybe even demonic or something like that. There's also some rules about bathroom hygiene. And so it's like, make sure you have your own shovel for poop and go and dig your own hole this far away from the camp and wash your hands and then come back. Yeah, that's just sanitary rules for when you're at war and you're away from the people. So there's also going to be some various social regulations. And so there's some laws on escaped slaves. So if you're at war and there are slaves that escape from the enemy camp, you don't return them. And so that one's not really about protecting the slaves as much as it is about not trying to help your enemy, more so on that part. And there's different laws on prostitution, and there are some laws on loans and interest. For the laws on prostitution, Israelite women could not be prostitutes, but just Israelite women. That was supposed to be a laugh or something. It's just the Israelite women. It's the only one the rules go against, which isn't to say there weren't prostitutes around Jerusalem and Israel. And there's also some laws on loans and interest. So you can't charge interest for Israelites. You can for other people. And so, again, we're having to deal with not taking advantage of your neighbor and things like that. So if they need money, you could loan that money. You can't charge interest on that money. There are some different laws on vows. And so let your yes be yes, let your no be no. And there's some different laws on harvesting. And so if you were into your neighbor's field, for some reason, I don't know why you would be in your neighbor's field. I guess maybe if you're just walking around, you could eat a handful of grapes, but you couldn't bring a bucket with you. And so Jesus actually talks about this too when he talks about them eating a handful of grain in the field. But you can't go and steal and intentionally harvest from their field. When I was younger in middle school, I used to mow this guy's yard, and he had blackberries and raspberries. And every time I would mow, I would just eat the blackberries and raspberries. And he told me when I started I could do that. Well, at the end of the year, he goes, I don't know why, but my blackberries just aren't producing this year. And then just looks at me. And then I didn't realize until after that he knew I was stealing his blackberries and raspberries because I would eat all of them. And he had a fig tree, and I would climb in it and eat them all. He probably had a camera on me or something. And so this deals with that. You can eat a few, but keep it cool, man. And so this is going to move on into chapter 24. There's going to be some different laws on divorce. Justice and compassion. There's this long part about how a man, again, can divorce the wife. And so if he divorces her, she is freed from him. And she cannot go back to him. You cannot remarry. So if she goes and marries another man, and then that man dies or they get divorced, he cannot go back to her. And so for the man, it's a way of saying take divorce seriously. For the woman, it's a way of saying they can't just be traded back and forth. And once she is divorced, she is back under the protection of her father. She doesn't still belong to the one she used to be married to, if that makes sense. She's not traded goods back and forth. There is some other parts that are going to deal with some different items of social justice. So again, we're going to talk about different exemptions for military service, for newlyweds. This had to do with if you don't have children. So if you're a woman in a society and you don't have, especially a male child, you were not in a good position for long-term success. And so the exemption for military service for newlyweds was about having kids. And that's what a lot of this section is going to deal with. There's different laws on pledges. And you could almost think about this part as like a collateral loan. And so if someone is like, I need your help for this thing, you could not say, all right, I'll help you, but if you don't follow through, I will take your mill, or I will hold on to this as collateral, or like I will take your house from you, or something like that. A millstone is what they would use to thresh their wheat, and so this is their livelihood. You can't take that from someone. And so again, it's about other people's dignity. It's about protecting those who are most vulnerable in society. These laws are a little bit more progressive. for this section. There's also laws on wages, and so people usually worked for as day laborers in the field and in the harvest. You had to pay them that day. There was no waiting 1 week. There was no waiting a long time. Also, if you're curious, the way ancient like wages would work, usually you would go and eat breakfast there, and then you would work for a few hours. You would take a nap, or you would eat lunch. Then you would take a nap, and then you would work like for the harvest, and then you might even eat dinner before being sent back home. And so the boss or the one who owned the field, it's not just like they gave them money; they're giving them the food for the day. And so, connecting it to the day wages, it's a way of not taking advantage of other people. There's also going to talk about laws for fair treatment. So this is just about how families figure out their own issues. And there's different care for protecting the vulnerable. This is a picture of when I was in Kenya. And so we went to an orphanage and we were giving out food right here.
When was that?
It was like, I only had like 4 pictures. It took me a long time to find because it was like in 2013 or something like that. I was really hard for me to find a picture, but I wanted to get one from there. But yeah, it was like in the summer, I think, of 2013. And so there's different just care for widows, orphans, and other people of the poor. And then this is the part I really like. There is the gleaning laws. And so if you were someone who owned a field, you were not supposed to harvest all of it. So you would leave the edges. And if some of what you harvested fell on the ground, you were not allowed to go back and pick it all up. And so you were to leave it there. We call this the law of gleaning. Some people call it the law of the field of the edges or something like that. Does this make you think of any book of the Bible? The book of Ruth has this. The book of Ruth. And so that's when Boaz, there's some other similarities in this. Did we not talk about levirate marriage? Is that next chapter? Oh, it's next chapter. Okay. The next chapter has another part that's very similar to the book of Ruth, which was also written by the Deuteronomist source. And so I really love this part. When I was a little young Alexander in college, and I had never read the book of Deuteronomy before, I had to write this paper. And I don't know if I picked this as my topic, but this was my topic. And it was supposed to be a really quick 3-page paper. And I spent hours on it, and it revolutionized my life. And this is like one of the laws that made me go, wait, the Old Testament is like good? And like it cared about people, and it's like really progressive in a lot of ways. During that week when we talked about this, we had this guy come, and he owned a lumber mill. And so, in my school, we asked, like, how would you apply this today? Those sort of things. And the way this guy at the lumber mill said is that he would just not vacuum up the dust shavings at the end of the day. And if people in the community wanted it, they could come and they could gather it. And so people use like dust shavings sometimes like for burning things or like in their gardens or something like that. But to me, I always thought, man, that really missed the point in a lot of ways of this. Because the way he talked about it, it was almost like he was just being lazy at the end of the day and not picking up the dust like the wood shavings. And so like we can take the law of gleaning to be a lot more stronger. One way is that we can think about this, it's giving people access to work. And so we do that in different ways in our society. We're not agrarian societies. The way people have access to work is transportation. People have to drive to get to jobs. Is education. People need degrees and certifications and trainings to go and work for themselves. Even just having capital. There are lots of ways in our society that we can think, how do we help people have access to work? Our lesson for this is the law of gleaning. In the law of gleaning, we see those who own the fields, and they have easy access to working because of that. Purposely leave the edges and leftovers for others to get access and work for themselves. Modern day ways of accessing the work include education and transportation, capital, childcare, healthcare, different things like that. What are ways do you think you could support this law of gleaning, not only in your life, but in the communities around you? things that I thought of that we as our church do. We do things with Justice Knots, which is about kind of improving some of our community standards, which happens to be tackling transportation this year. Or next year? This year? It's this year, yeah. It's dealing with, we don't have good transportation for people. Things like fish. If you're hungry and you can't even feed yourself, it's really hard to go out and get a different job and work. Different things like VMC, which is helping people kind of at the bottom get reestablished. There's Family Promise. I know for me, when we lost our house, I couldn't think about doing anything else. I didn't even know there was a few months we didn't know where we were going to be sleeping that week. And so, like, there are different things. And the other one is, this is a mirror. There are ways that you can make a difference too. There are people in this parish that have helped us with Poppy. Like, one thing Denise does is come and read her books. Sometimes the Willoughbys, if we miss childcare, I'll call them. I'm like, can you keep Poppy? And that makes a really big difference in our lives, to be able to go and work. And Rachel and I work really relaxed jobs where we can bring our kids. There are other young families in this parish that, like, you know, to offer, like, hey, I could watch your kid. That can make the world of a difference. And so thinking about this law of gleaning, it's what are ways I free up people to go and live their lives or go into work for themselves. It's about dignity. And so all of these chapters are a way of giving people back their dignity. And even when that, for me, might mean I'm not as profitable or I have to give something up. And that's what these chapters deal with. It's very powerful. I love that part. I love chapter 25. But then we get to chapter 26, and we're going to talk a little bit more about these ideas of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. So there's some different laws on punishment and justice. And so if you had done something wrong, you had to go to the court. And if the judge kind of sentenced you in your city, then he would have to watch the punishment take place. And the example that it gives here is like having 40 lashes. I put a picture of what the lashes look like. I guess when I was a kid, I always thought like it was like a string or something. When you got lashes, like those are barbed parts at the end. It would kind of dig out the flesh. And I'll tell you one thing that's kind of cool. What kind of grew in the rabbinic tradition is you would never, ever, ever want to exceed the punishment. And so anytime that you were punished for 40 lashes, like that's the maximum. They would stop before they got to that point, because you would never want to exceed the punishment. And we're talking about reining the punishment in. And so here the judge sentences someone. He has to watch the punishment take place. And if it was 40, then they would only do 39, just in case they miscounted, or the one punishing it got too into it. It's also going to do with some different fairness in commerce. And so you may have heard the phrase, don't muzzle the ox. It starts off from this chapter. And so if the ox is working in the field, it's about dignity for the animal. If it's hungry or thirsty, let it eat or drink. It's not like this thing we take advantage of for my own use. It's something that we're working with together. There's also the Levirate marriage laws. Do you know what these are? So it comes from the Latin word that is like a brother-in-law, and essentially it was if a brother died and that wife is left without kids, the other brother would help her have kids. And again, this is not having to do with like rape or something like that. This was a way of giving a woman dignity, to have kids, to continue the family name. And if the brother refused, she would take him to the court. If he refused, then she would slap him in the face. And it says, and let it be known, like you were the one that was slapped, I think is how it says it. Oh, is it spit? Okay, yes.
Something about sandals.
And so,
Cut off his sandals.
that's what, oh yeah, with the sandal, that's what it is. And so, again, this is about dignity. It's about the position of the woman in society and being cared for and things like that.
What if the woman didn't want children? Or was that
Then she could go back to her father's, under her father's protection. Though typically you might not want to do that because that's shameful. And so, because you want to be on your own. Just as a small note, there are lots of different ways marriage works in the Bible. There's like what we think of as like a man and a woman, but also there's like a man with a woman that then has concubines, or there's a man that is married and he's also then therefore has access to that woman's slaves, like Abraham. There is a man that can be married to lots of people. There's the Levirate one. You could be married through a dead brother. You could, if you're raped, then you could be married to your rapist. You could be a prisoner of war that's married to the soldier. You could be slaves that were assigned together. marriage doesn't work the same way when we think about marriage as about happiness in a life partner. In the ancient world, marriage has to do with kids, it has to do with protection, it has to do with dignity and standing in society. When we're talking about marriage like this, just remember marriage was thought of very differently. And so that's one thing that's helpful to keep in mind. When we talk about different things like this, if you want to read a book on it, there you go. Here's a book. I don't recommend it, but you could. There's also this weird part about two husbands fighting, and the woman goes and grabs the man, and he goes up. And then they would cut off her hand. Again, there is no account anywhere of this actually happening. And this has to do, again, with dignity, and it has to do with I guess the man gets the better treatment there, but it's about protecting that man's dignity. And so this is stopping the woman from getting killed, though. And so it also has to do with her dignity as well, even though there's no account of anyone actually getting their hand cut off. Usually it would be a payment or something like that. There's also some laws about using honest weights and measurements. If you were to buy something, they would use a scale to get the amount. You couldn't have an unbalanced scale. Strangely, there's no actual punishment given, but it says they are abhorrent to the Lord, which I guess is pretty bad. And then there's this strange part that this ends that has to do with the Amalekites' punishment. The Amalekites were those really big, giant type people like Goliath. And it seems very strange to end a chapter like that. But that's because, again, we're about to enter the promised land, which is what we're going to do in chapter 26. Ooh, oh my word. Okay, and so we're going through this part really quick. It deals with the first fruits. This is all, we all talked about this last week. So you would offer your first fruits of the harvest. Now you have land to farm. That's why it's talking about this. And then there is this really cool declaration of faith and gratitude that they would go through. Chapter 26 is a fun chapter to read. They would do a tithe on the third year. So every year they say the tithe to give to God. On the third year, they would give it to the Levites or to the poor. So those that can't farm for themselves. There's Jesus feeding the people. He would also come with a prayer. And then it ends with this kind of covenant commitment at the end. And I put this piece of like liturgy here because chapter 26 is like this whole big ceremony liturgy. And it's really worth reading. And you can't really wrap it up. But our lesson for this is about the first fruits and Thanksgiving. It invites us to reflect on God's blessing and respond with obedience and gratitude. I'm not going to read the rest of this, but this is this chapter about being thankful for God, giving God the best, the first fruits, and having ceremonies of gratitude when you do that. Ooh, we finished all of the laws. We did it! Yay! Okay. Just as a reminder, these follow through the Decalogue, and so it kind of follows some of the same order. Next week, we're going to talk about Moses' final speech. And so read chapters 27 through 30. It really is worth reading. If you did not read chapter 26, that kind of ceremony, really recommend reading that one. And this is a preview of what we're going to be looking at next week. I think I will tweak this outline somewhat, but I just wanted to show it to you because it's blessings and curses and covenant on the two mountains, and the renewal of the covenant, and then, what do you do because of that covenant? And here's our two mountains. One mountain is really nice, and one is not. And you get that choice. And so we'll have a field trip next week. If you want to walk outside, email me and let me know, or stay after class. If you want to stay in here, let me know that too. The Lord be with you. My God, we thank you. We are done with the laws. Amen. Woo. Okay.
Go outside, Alexander. Where are we going?
Well, so where I thought that we would go up on the lab. No, that would be fun. Also, my first job was at Chick-fil-A, and the training was 2nd mile service, and it talks about that part about carrying the backpack and going that 2nd mile, going above and beyond. I was thinking we would go maybe to the labyrinth and then to the like community garden because it's like uphill and downhill. It's not the same as two mountains, but just to read like a smaller ritual version, like a covenant that we're going to make for ourselves, kind of thing. But we might just do it on either side of the room. I don't know. Do y'all want to go outside and do that?
Depends on the weather.
Depends on the weather. It is summer. It is summer.
It's raining? No.
Sure, if it's a nice day.
I've seen a few no's though, which I want to
If it's
be.
raining, no.
Weather permitting.
And Marcia gave a scary no.
Thank you, Alexander.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite law? Mine's the law of gleaning. I love that one. It really was like a life transforming moment for me.
To be clean?
No, the gleaning
Oh,
one.
cleaning,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. The edges of the field one.
I thought that was great.
Oh, I forgot. And the book of Ruth has both that and the Levirate marriage
I
one.
can't believe
And so that's just really cool.
And I know so little
And you
Bible.
said the
That's
author of
surprising.
Deuteronomy also wrote Ruth.
It's in the same school. Yeah. So
Thank you.
Thanks.
I love Deuteronomy.
I'm a little done with Deuteronomy. These last 2 weeks, I'm like, oh my word.
Yeah, it's hard.